Well, welcome everybody. It's been quite a day today. It's been quite a year, and it's my great privilege to chair quite an unusual meeting at Chatham House, one in which we are putting on stage my colleagues and showing our own expertise on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what we're looking at is not only the whole issue of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also how it's changed the world. So we've got people from different parts of Chatham House with different expertise. We've got Leslie Vinjamuri, who's the director of the US and Americas program and the dean of the Queen Elizabeth II Academy for Leadership in International Affairs. Well known, I'm sure, to everyone here. We have Creon Butler, who's the research director for trade, investment, and new governance models and the director of the Global Economy and Finance program. We have James Nixie, who's the director of the Russia and Eurasia program. And we have Orysia Lusiewicz, who is the research fellow Russia-Eurasia program and head of the Ukraine Forum. My name is Patricia Lewis. I'm the research director for conflict science and transformation and the director for international security. And as I said, today's been quite a day. We're here to talk about what's going on with Russia and its invasion of Ukraine and the impact that it's had on the world. And today we heard a long, very long State of the Nation address from President Putin. And yet another nuclear treaty blow, with a suspension of participation and a threat on another treaty. And a very short, I thought, passionate rallying speech of solidarity from President Biden in Poland. So much has happened in the last year, and we thought that this meeting, which is on the record, and please tweet about it, and I welcome everybody who is online, and please put in your questions. And we thought we'd have a look from the different perspectives. From each of us. And I wondered perhaps if I could start with you, Orysia. You're very much engaged in what's going on in Ukraine. You have an extraordinary experience. And I know that perhaps for you, this war has had the hugest impact of everyone on the panel. So perhaps we could start with your views, your vision, and what you think has happened.
Thank you very much, Patricia. It's unusual indeed. I don't think we've ever been on the same panel as James as speakers, although I've been here now for 10 years and started the Ukraine Forum almost 9 years ago when Russia annexed Crimea. And what it is called now in Ukraine was the first Russian-Ukrainian war. Now Ukraine is fighting the second Russian-Ukrainian war. And it has been, of course, the dark times in a way that there's this vicious irony where Russia is erasing its own imprint in southeast of Ukraine, where indeed, when Putin spoke today again about gathering of these, what he calls historic lands, he is erasing everything that has been, to a degree, achieved through colonization of Russian Empire to southeast of Ukraine. He is destroying cities, Ukrainian cities like Mariupol, Volnovakha, Bakhmut, Enerhodar. He's bombing Dnipro, Kharkiv, where there's mainly Russian-speaking population that lives there, that he himself, in his twisted mind, says he is trying to protect. And all of this results in a silver lining, kind of the bright side of this, where it is actually destroying, putting the nail in the coffin of the Russian world. And what it means is this kind of neo-Soviet nostalgia, historical manipulation of what has happened and why Ukrainian nation doesn't exist. It's this imperial grandeur that Putin very much wants to make his own legacy that is completely collapsing in Ukraine as we speak, as walls and windows of Ukrainian houses are collapsing. So it became very clear what Ukrainian nation stands for, and it became an immense accelerator of that process. So today in Ukraine, almost 70% of Ukrainians believe that Soviet Union was a totalitarian state that pursued state terror. And that specific legacy of the Soviet regime reincarnated itself in Putin and must be put to justice, brought to justice. They support sanctions on Russian clergy and complete split from the Byzantine Russian type Orthodoxy and creation of independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is not a fifth column of Russia in Ukraine. They support Ukrainian language as the only language of communication in state affairs, and we see a dramatic shift, for example, of those who are saying that Ukraine should be bilingual to those who are saying that Ukraine should actually have that identity protected. And most importantly, I think Ukraine shed this complex of inferiority that Russians were so hard instilling into Ukrainians over centuries, I would argue, and Ukrainians see for what Russia is. And I think one of the best description of it is a colossus on clay feet. There's no fear of Russia despite all this destruction because they know it's a weak state and they understand that the days of that regime are numbered. When Putin invaded Ukraine, it was clear that he, in a way, was unleashing the beginning of his end. Ukrainians are very realistic. They don't expect that end to happen in 1 or 2, perhaps years, but they know that this is imminent, and they believe that this is a fight worth pursuing. So just to say that, of course, there has been a lot of unexpected things about Ukraine, and one of the unexpected things, including for me, is how functional Ukraine is, and throughout this year, you have railways running. We were just discussing, even high-level officials taking Ukrainian trains, including President Biden yesterday. The banking system is working, economies remain digital, the internet connection is working, anti-corruption agencies are working, and I think this is something I'd like to point to because Ukraine, has this negative image for corruption. And throughout this year, what just happened within that sphere is that there's new anti-corruption prosecutor that was appointed, and the High Anti-Corruption Court reviewed almost 30 verdicts and actually returned to the state budget almost 27 million pounds of various assets that were acquired in a corrupt way to support Ukrainian armed forces. So there is determination of Ukrainian, both senior leadership and society, to pursue that. And Ukrainians are, in a way, determined to also fight until they restore territorial integrity. I think it's very important to understand why this emotion to fight remains so strong despite the suffering. And it's mainly because they understand that Russians will not stop at whatever territorial concessions they get, and they will pursue a new invasion, and also because of all the war crimes that they are committing, and something we have seen throughout the year, documented by both international human rights, UN Human Rights Council, the Criminal Court in The Hague, and Ukrainians understand that this is the war of extermination, and they will fight for every inch of Ukrainian territory and for every Ukrainian citizens. So just to wrap up, I think what Ukraine achieved this year is clearly it has won its place in the transatlantic security. It has demonstrated that it belongs because of the values. And just for us, all of us to remember, whenever in the future Russia will say that it was NATO that was provoking this war. In December of 2012, there was 15% support for NATO, and today, in October of 2022, 83% of Ukrainians support full membership in NATO as the only security guarantee against any future invasion. This is what Ukrainians will pursue. Whether they will be successful, it takes two to tango, but I think there's a very clear understanding where Ukraine belongs. I'll stop here.
Yeah. I mean, Putin does remind us of a gaslighting spouse who says, you know, you made me do it, after he hits his wife. James, on to you. I've just characterized Russia as I see it.
Good one.
You know, what's been going on in Russia? How has this impacted ordinary Russians? I think we all know, we read everything all the time, but what are some unusual takeaways perhaps that you might have for us?
Yeah. So, tough day, tough week, tough year. Leslie and I were just saying as we walked into the room, but you know, where were you when you heard about the invasion? It's one of those very few moments in life. September 11, I can think of a couple of others perhaps where you know exactly where you were. So that's testament to it as well. And it has, of course, tested Western systems and structures and resolve, and will continue to do so. And that's perhaps the biggest imponderable. And that's where Chatham House comes together. I mean, Kirill will no doubt talk a lot about that himself from his sort of thematic point of view. It's where Chatham House comes together very well, I feel. Yourself, not least, Patricia. But yes, I thought I would try and be a good student and talk about how it changed Russia, I suppose. Being the largest country in the world still, and should continue to be, unless it breaks up. It's not out of the question. I think this war, first of all, it'll test Vladimir Putin. He spent 30% of his life being Russia's ruler, and his ability to control his own population and achieve domestic obedience is going to be increasingly difficult, and I'll come back to that. But also his military is going to be tested as well, and just looking at it from that point of view. 80% of Russia's ground forces are being used up in Ukraine right now. Overall, I think it's probably fair to say they've performed poorly, poorer than expected, despite some recent incremental gains. But the difficulties of, say, taking Volodya, for example, that was quite a humiliation just recently. And it's not impossible. We even, you and I have been talking a little bit about scenarios lately, Patricia, and but you would see an implosion along the front line, desertion, rebellion, something like that, and that would be disastrous for him. And it actually brings us back to the domestic stability point, because obvious failure on the battlefield doesn't just mean he has to scale back his imperial dreams. It means he'd quite clearly be at risk from an angry and increasingly impoverished population, and from a palace coup, if a significant cohort of people in the elite believe that Russia is headed down the wrong path. I'm not saying, just to be clear, that is the most likely possibility necessarily, but it does get more likely the worse that Russia's performance is, and the more dissatisfied the population is, and that's what we see. I mean, it's in terms of how Russians are looking at the war right now. It's a difficult question because, I mean, you can roughly look at it. It's a bit of a generalization, but you can sort of look at it as 20% are very much rabidly supporting the war, 20% are against it, quite firmly, and there's a sort of a 60% in the middle. It depends on the question you ask, of course, and etc. But that's sort of where we are. But I mean, I think just going back to the impoverishment of the population, then Russia was never richer than it was the day before it invaded Ukraine in 2014, in fact. And it's steadily gotten worse, and now it's going to get an awful lot worse. I mean, not least because I think the sanctions are beginning to bite. I don't know if Kirill's going to say a little bit more about that.
President Biden said there'd be more this week coming on.
Exactly. But I think more than that, but Russia is depleting itself in this war. It's putting so much of itself into it, the mobilization of the economy. But that said, obviously, for Russia, as with so much else, I suppose, much is contingent on the outcome of this war. And if you think Russia will be defeated, then the manner of that defeat, if you think Putin will leave, how he will leave in a coffin or going silently into the night or having chosen his successor. I mean, these are all possibilities for an open window. So I think a lot of what we say about Russia is contingent upon how this is going to pan out. But I guess in the context of this event, then my real point is that one of the countries that is most profoundly going to be changed by Russia's war is Russia. And so, possibly radically and possibly in a good way with an opportunity for a new start. I can see a silver lining. But but as I sort of joked at the start, it is not really a joke. Possibly leading to the federated states of a new Russia, the implosion and fragmentation of Russia, what we all feared back in 1991 or 1990, if you like. I don't necessarily think so, but it's certainly within the scope of the imagination that I wasn't able to imagine, before February 24th of last year. So there's not much we can say for certain, but I do think we can say this. Win, draw, messy outcome, uncertain outcome, no outcome, frozen conflict, everlasting war, stalemate, Russia's going to get a lot poorer. Partly because, as I say, of the sanctions, and partly because of its depleting effects. And that poverty will lead to further repression. I know it's pretty bad right now. We're at the stage of book banning and legalized violence and assassinations and political prisoners, of course, and possibly further conflict escalation. So my takeaway, I guess, is that Russia's going to change. And even though it's entirely correct to be restraining Russia, even punishing Russia, don't have an issue with that, it's going to get a worse place to be if you're unlucky enough to be a Russian citizen, I suppose, and a more difficult place to deal with.
Thanks, James. Leslie, from the United States perspective and across the Atlantic and the Atlantic Alliance.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for putting this panel together. I guess to all my colleagues in the front rows who've done all the work. It's sort of, on the one hand, it's been a long year. On the other hand, I feel like I need the disclaimer in front of anything I say that, our views and our understanding of this are rapidly developing. And when one tries to look back and say, what's changed, what's the same, what are the implications, it's inevitable that anybody who's a thinking human being will develop and change their views, so don't hold me accountable. So the first thing that it really struck me is, we've had so many conversations over the last many years across the UK, across Europe, across the US, across the world, about the end of the rules-based order, the end of the liberal order. We've talked about 2001 was a landmark moment, 2008, the financial crisis, 2016, the election of Donald Trump. But it does feel like 2022, the invasion, really did mark a fundamental transformation, a turning point, which might have been a long time coming for multiple reasons, but the return of major war in Europe. And for those of us in my generation that really cut our teeth and kind of came into the world of international affairs thinking about the wars in the Balkans, right? When people were saying, war in Europe, it feels like there was obviously things weren't peaceful everywhere, and obviously there's been a lot of instability in various forms. But the return of major war in Europe, the return of conventional war, hard power, geography, politics, geopolitics, the return of the state, and the focus on really pretty normal historical things that are pretty awful has taken us away from where I think we thought we were, which is that we just focus on the big global challenges and how to cooperate to tackle them. Alongside that, I think that this has shone a light on the reality, which is not new to many people or many states around the globe, that the international security architecture is not fit for purpose. The UN Security Council, and perhaps we'll look back and say, the heyday was 1990 when it came together to really call to account and to give legitimate authority to pushing back Iraq out of Kuwait. It feels like now it's deadlocked, and that any pretense that it had, and I recognize the profound critique that are very real, but any pretense that it had to being the legitimate authority that would decide when it was okay to use force seems to be gone, and the ability to really use that body to decide on major issues of peace and security seems to have been, in the most profound way possible. And recognizing the very serious critique of 2003 that many people make, it now seems to be that is fundamentally flawed, and there's not much to say about it. Thirdly, on regional security, It feels like the game for security is back in the regions, and that the U.S. has clearly been pulled very much back into probably not where it intended to be when Biden was elected, which is into the game of transatlantic security. The importance of NATO has clearly been reaffirmed after many years of Trump bashing it and many people believing that had he been reelected that he would have pulled the U.S. Outside of NATO, but it goes beyond that, and I would say that the importance of regional security and NATO and the U.S. as a major security provider is also confirmed by the fact that the whole conversation that had begun to dominate European corridors about strategic autonomy is gone. It's not that there isn't a conversation that Europe can and should do this. Many people are arguing that. But the real focus, say at our Berlin conference a year and a half ago, Chatham House Berlin conference, when Macron said, NATO's brain dead and we need to do strategic autonomy, that is just not where the conversation is right now. And the other component of this, and this sort of takes you in a slightly different direction on the regional security, is that the other two post-war, not post-Cold War, but post-war bets seem to be very different. And that's the role of Germany and its own position on defense and security, and the role of Japan. So pretty significant changes, not clear where they'll go. Fourth point, the rest. We all know that the rest, in terms of GDP and population, are not with the West on this war. But one of the real challenges is that, the major players in the rest, China and India being two, have said for a very long time that what they cared about was sovereignty, and that does not seem to be where they're putting their cards in this particular war, which leads me to believe that the tension and the conflict between the West and the rest is much graver than we think. Because if they're not willing to back the UN Security Council resolution sanctioning Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, a clear violation of the UN Charter, and clearly speaking to what they've said matters most, then clearly there's a whole lot more going on that isn't just about sovereignty. There's fundamental contestation, not only over values, but over who's going to control the globe. So going forward, I guess just a few quick thoughts. We know that there's a fundamental question of whether unity will be maintained inside the US, whether unity will be maintained inside of Europe and across Europe, and whether the unity will be maintained between the US and Europe. We have a big question mark about how much stronger the alliance will become between China and Russia. If that becomes stronger and the West becomes weaker, we're in some pretty grave trouble. And then a final comment, I guess, on the US, and the big outstanding question is what happens in the US after 2024. I'm on the optimistic side, which I think is grounded in evidence. But I recognize that there's a whole lot that could happen. A week is a long time in politics. But obviously, if there's a fundamental change of leadership and any other number of things that could happen in the US, then the whole bet on the question of Western unity will also change.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm going to come back to you all with questions, but I'm going to restrain myself for now and turn to Creon. Creon, if you could just take us through, some of the international economic trade issues, which I think is a more mixed picture, right, since a year ago.
Well, thanks, Patricia. And I think it is, there's lots of bad stuff that's happened, but there are also some potentially positive things that could come of what we've seen over the past year. I really wanted to make 3 points to start off with. Firstly, the picture we face in terms of what's happened in the economic world is, it's an obvious point. It's really complex to try and trace through what is happening as a result of Russia's attack on Ukraine and what was happening because of all the other things that have been going on, not least the global pandemic and even, the legacy from the global financial crisis of 10 years or so ago. Another reason it's really complicated is that the impact of Russia's attack has come through many different channels. So first of all, you've had the fact you've got a major war in Europe, and that creates economic disruption, not just in Ukraine and Russia, but also in the region around, and that has an immediate impact economically. You've then got the unprecedented Western economic sanctions. And I've worked on sanctions in the past. Indeed, I worked on the rather sort of very different type of set of sanctions in 2014. There are a number of reasons why it was really different this time. One was the threshold that Putin crossed in the international security sense meant that there was a complete unity among the G7, at least a very large amount of unity about what needed to be done. And that pushed if you like, their willingness to do a number of things much further than has been the case in the past. And you had, I think in practice, 4 areas that you could identify. First of all, excluding Russia from the financial system, essentially excluding Russian banks from the payment system, but also actions such as freezing 50% or so of Russian central bank foreign exchange reserves, something that had not been done really for a country of the economic significance of Russia in the past, and which has a lot of implications. Secondly, on the anti-corruption side, I mean, the latest figure I saw was 1,500 people have been sanctioned through anti-corruption, but also those who've been supporting President Putin in his action. And also this is leading to further measures. So we're seeing in Canada, for example, legislation that may enable you to freeze and confiscate not just the assets of people who've been involved in kleptocracy, but also people who've been involved in supporting war crimes. Then you've got the sanctions that sought to exclude or prevent Russia from accessing technologies, whether for weapons or across the whole board in terms of supporting their energy infrastructure, or in terms of the civil airline industry. The fact that Airbus and Boeing, which account for 70% of Russia's airline fleet, are not supplying planes or parts, which has a major impact. And then finally, really, really new area, which is in the hydrocarbon area, the idea of a price cap. So this is not a sanction in the traditional sense. It's not intended to prevent Russia from exporting a product. It's trying to prevent Russia from raising revenue from that product. And not just the unity of the G7, but also the way in which these sanctions have interacted with other developments like climate change, for example, have meant that a number of the moves have been irrevocable in the way that they wouldn't have been irrevocable in the absence of climate change, have meant that this is a wholly new world. I think, I don't have any doubt that this was the right thing to do, but I think there are a lot of consequences from what has been done, which we're going to have to work through subsequently. And indeed, there are questions which I think relevant particularly for the G7 and the G20 about, for example, when you freeze a country's foreign exchange reserves, that raises a whole bunch of questions. Other countries are going to worry about that, probably quite, for in some cases good, some cases not so good reasons. Do you want to just leave it out there as a sort of constructive ambiguity and say, you've got to think it out for yourself when we would do the same thing, or do you want to provide some kind of clarity on which a measure of this kind would be taken? Just 2 other sort of quick points. I think firstly, when this happened, if you look back to October 2021, we were predicting growth for 2022 of 4.9%. In fact, it's turned out at 3.4%. So the change is not, this is IMF forecast, the change is not as dramatic as might have been thought at the time. And I think it's been sharper, the impact in advanced countries, particularly because of the impact on Europe, than it has been in emerging markets. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. One is the extraordinary flexibility of the private sector in responding to shocks of this kind. I mean, you can see that in terms of the energy conservation measures in Europe that have taken place. But also you've had other events going on, such as China's emergence from no COVID, which has sort of boosted world growth. I think the final, given this really shortage of time, is in terms of the long-term impact from this, or what is the really important impact. I think it's important to think through really careful each of the issues. So if you look at inflation, there was an inflation surge. We got up to nearly 9% inflation in 2022. But the actions of central banks, the fact that energy prices have dropped quite dramatically, means that we may well be down, according to the IMF forecast, 4% by 2024. So that probably is not going to be a major impact from this event. On the other hand, if you look at the acceleration of the net zero transition in Europe, so saying this is a ratchet effect. Once you change from one form of energy system to another system, there's no way you're going to go back because of the way that interacts with climate change. Now, if you look at previous examples of sanctions, you might well have had a reversion, but this is not going to be the case here. And then the final point I'd just make would be about global economic governance. So this was, it looked like it was in real trouble in terms of the spring of 2022. A number of Western countries walked out of the G20 meetings. It looks like there's been a sort of thought on both sides, actually, as to whether that was such a good idea, so that the Indonesians managed to produce an outcome to their summit in Bali. I think from the West point of view, they said, actually, we need the G20 for broader discussions with China and others. And also, it's very interesting that Russia basically, the thing they wanted more than anything was not to get excluded from the G20. In terms of everything else, they just stayed quiet. And it's very interesting when you look at the outcome statements, there's a bit which says one group of countries feels this, that they shouldn't be in the G20, another group of countries feels something else. And then all of the rest of it is the type of outcomes that you would normally expect. So I think there is a big question looking forward for global economic governance, whether actually this is not in as bad a shape, if you like, as the international security architecture.
That's interesting. And I would say in connection with that to Leslie, what we've seen is a huge transformation in the UN, moving away from the Security Council, which is not the first time it's been frozen for decades in the Cold War, but to the General Assembly, which is, again, a new type of governance on the international level, and actually has a lot more going for it in some ways than relying completely on the Security Council. I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to quickly bring Auricia and Creon together to think about the reconstruction of Ukraine. For whatever happens at the end, hopefully it will be over, there will be Ukraine intact, able to build itself again. Where will this money come from? Who will be paying? Russia will be paying, right? Will it be the frozen assets of the oligarchs or the frozen assets of the state? How will this work? So perhaps, Auricia, we could start with you, what your vision for reconstruction would look like. Is it build back better? Is that a terrible phrase or what?
Yeah.
But, what is it?
Well, I'd say that reconstruction already started in Ukraine.
Yes.
It's not something that Ukraine can afford planning for later, but the thinking about the type of Ukraine that must emerge out of this war is here, and it takes place across government, across business community, across civil society. And what is very clear is that it will be Ukraine that complies and resembles the type of a European Union nation that includes green transition, that includes decentralized governments, that includes power to the regions, that also includes quite strong logistics links with the European Union, that includes integration of Ukraine within the European energy system, trade, and something that is clear now, what makes Ukraine resilient today is something that Ukraine wants to build on, but again, more and better, is digital economy, is IT sector, it's in addition to its agriculture that is a powerhouse and that actually could drive a lot of growth and innovation around that. Ukraine wants to keep that more modern type economy. And to be honest, Ukrainians have a very modernization agenda. We ran this survey of civil society organization late November, beginning of December, and most groups say we need to modernize Ukraine, not just rebuild it the way it is. And this is the main message, and they see a European integration process, that very important EU candidate status that Ukraine achieved as a pathway to rebuilding Ukraine after the war.
I just say, I mean, I'm a real optimist about Ukraine in the long term as an economy, and particularly because of the accession track with the EU, but for many other reasons, domestic reasons as well. And in a way, this offsets what is real deep pessimism about Russia, where I agree very much with James's analysis. The thing I would, though, however, say is that the West is already, I think the latest figures, I was looking at the Kiel Institute, Western spending is already 140 billion since the war began. That's both military and economic and other support. 50% of that is from the US. Now, to the extent that there is limited amount of money, which there is, I think it's far more important the West spends the money now on enabling Ukraine to win, whether it's through weapons supplies or through budgetary support. Because I think once the war stops, there is a very positive economic growth model for Ukraine available. And that doesn't necessarily need, nor will it necessarily get, a lot of aid finance from the West at that point. There may well be, aid grant giving from the West at that point. There may well be finance, and hopefully as much private finance as possible linked to the diaspora and so on. But to the extent that there has to be a choice in terms of how the West spends money, I would spend it now rather than later.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thanks a lot, Kriyan. Leslie, turning to you, we heard President Biden Day speak to the American people about what Americans think, right? It was almost like he was rallying the United States population. Is this because he fears the debate coming up with the presidential election? Do you think he's trying to create this backbone in the United States to not think about this as yet another foreign war in the way that some have been characterizing it?
I mean, the first thing I would say, and I think it was said far better than me by the U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, who spoke very, very well at the Munich Security Conference and reminded people that Americans, as she said, across America in places that you will never have heard of are flying the Ukrainian flag. So there has been tremendous support across the United States from all corners for Ukraine. It's been really phenomenally remarkable. What we also know, and our colleague who is based in Washington, Bruce Stokes, published a piece with Chatham House showing the data that over time, he was looking at Americans, I suspect it's true far beyond the United States, that as the longer that wars go on, the more that they lose domestic support. And that's shown in Vietnam, that's shown in Afghanistan. These are not all the same conflicts by any stretch of the imagination, but on this dimension of public support, you lose public support the longer you're in a war. So part of what President Biden is trying to do, for multiple reasons, only one of them is about the domestic audience, is to shore up that support. And I think what we saw at Munich, what we heard at Munich, what we all know is that absent momentum, it's going to be hard to get the kind of successes on the ground that will sustain popular support and infuse that through Congress. But to your specific question about what happens as the U.S. moves into, we're still a little ways off, but a year from now, we're not going to be very far off. We're going to be in an election season, which is very hard to imagine, but boy, is it going to look radically different in the U.S., the nature of political debate. And I hate to say it, but it does seem very likely that partisanship around U.S. spending and its impacts and its successes and what is Europe doing, and has Europe stayed the course, has Europe stayed united, has Europe paid its share, I think that debate is going to be fundamentally different if we meet again in 1 year's time.
Thanks a lot. And finally, James, Russian people, are they prepared for failure? And how do we support the Russian population who've been lied to, misled, and so ill-used by their government once this is all over?
I thought you were going to ask me about Putin's speech today, but you didn't. That's fine. I'll answer the question. They are not prepared for failure, because that is not an acceptable outcome in the TV messaging in which they are fed. And victory, as with all propagandists, is a certainty, and their rightness is foretold. I mean, it's quite astonishing. Those of you who do suffer any Russian TV watching, the dehumanization of Ukrainians, followed by documentaries about the war. It's quite a non-stop diet. But then on your question about how do we help them, I think in a post-war situation, not now, obviously, we're going to have to as well. I mean, I don't know, that does bring into some conflict about the question about Ukrainian reconstruction. Because in a sense, if there is a different regime, a better regime, a more easier liberal regime, if you will,
Or it could get worse before it gets worse.
absolutely, of course, and then but then there's not much we can do in that time. But then I think we're going to have an issue about rebuilding Russia. If again, I know I've been talking a little bit about slightly speculative scenarios this evening, but if you do get a Russian leader who, Khrushchev came after Stalin, and the Korean War ended, and there was a better time. It's not beyond the realms of possibility again. Then he's going to come asking for handouts as well, and we're going to be a little bit stuck, because obviously people have always wanted to help Russia because of the numbers of nuclear weapons. Would you like me to say a couple of words about the Putin speech, or do you want to move on? No, because I wanted to something back to you. I can do 1 minute, but it's up to you.
Go on then.
1 minute, okay, because I feel I should have done. I promised you I would, and I lied. Look, Putin's speech today was, I suppose, impressive. He's 70 years old, which is quite old for a Russian man who presumably drinks these days. We've now seen him a little bit drunk. And he, and you could see some of the people in the audience nodding off or visibly bored, actually. And we've seen it all before. I mean, there's a quite real suspension of reality here, obviously blaming the West, Ukrainian historical obscenity, et cetera, et cetera. And combined with that, we saw the idea that he would make better on his promises to improve the lives of farmers, of teachers, of health workers, etc. But again, it's very hard to see that when, of course, he's quite obviously making Russians' lives an awful lot worse by engaging Russia in this war. The kernel of it, though, the hard bit of the speech, and this is where I pass it over to you, was Russia's suspension of its participation in New START. And that does strike me as something new that I didn't anticipate, and you were saying to me earlier, I hope you don't mind, in the green room, that what really affected you, and this is, we were talking about the emotions at the very beginning of this, was the possible nuclear testing as well, and about your life's work, Patricia, being slightly undone. And I'd love to hear a little more about that.
No, thanks. I mean, I'll just quickly address that. I mean, so what Putin said was that they will suspend their participation, not to withdraw. That hasn't been said, as far as we understand the translation into English. And at the moment, since COVID, in fact, inspections have been halted, and they haven't got back on track. They tried in November last year to have a meeting, and that was, because of the war, was postponed. Nonetheless, throughout the whole of this, Russia has carried on with the notifications under the treaty. So the question is, will those stop? Because that would be a great worry, because those notifications are also about missile tests. And you want those notifications because they keep everyone safe, right? And it means that they're not misunderstood as a real missile launch. That's really important. So that's one thing. The other question is, will they then abrogate the terms of the treaty and start building up their nuclear weapons again? And that would be, another worry. Then the thing that really disturbed me was that they talked about nuclear testing. Now, Russia is a fully ratified state party to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And nonetheless, of course, like all of the nuclear weapon states, have kept a non-nuclear capability to make sure that the warheads are safe. So they have still the test sites, which are non-nuclear tests. But he said that if the United States were to carry out a nuclear test, then they would. Now, the United States has no plans, no intention of carrying out a nuclear weapons test. So is this another false narrative coming out, like we saw over the bioweapons, over the dirty bomb, etc.? Is this another thing? So that's a real worry. From our perspective. I'm going to go to the audience now because I realise that we are running behind time. Now, what I thought was, because we've got quite a lot of people, I'm not going to ask for one question at a time. I'm going to go for 3 questions. So that would mean, please take notes, panel, so that you don't have to answer each question. Okay, so could we have this lady here, please, with the glasses on the top? Thank you.
Terry Paddock, I'm a Chatham House member. I work in social media, and I really worry that the West is losing the information war. Today, on the day of 2 speeches, if you go on Twitter, for instance, and just type in Putin, the majority of comments are pro-Putin narratives. They are saying that NATO did start the war. They are saying that his assessment of Western culture normalizing pedophilia is correct. Is this something that you track, and how important do you think it is?
Thank you. I think I'll go to this gentleman here in the middle, please. If you could wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Dr. Chukwu Megemba, member of Chatham House. Yes, member of Chatham House. I have a personal attachment to what is happening in Ukraine because I married there. I schooled there. I spent the best of my educational academic life in Ukraine, and my 2 children were also born there, so I have interest. But I've got a lot of questions, but I will make it brief and direct. One question. Now, historically speaking, will what is happening in Ukraine, directly or indirectly, could it lead to something bigger that we have not anticipated yet? Bearing in mind the alliance between Russia and China with Taiwan in mind.
Thank you. Excellent question. Right, so the gentleman here, please, at the back. Thank you.
Michiel Remmers, member of Chatham House. Just a quick question on the outlook in the US. Leslie, you said you were quite positive. I read yesterday articles in The Atlantic by Elliot Cohen, by Ann Applebaum. If people from that side of the debate were extremely positive about Biden's symbolism yesterday and today, isn't there much more reason if we also look at Munich this weekend and the senators from both parties who were present there to be very positive about the outlook on this?
Thank you. And there are many questions online, but one of them that is recurring is how much can we believe the Russian figures on the economics, the amount of rubles that Putin talked about? Do we trust the statistics coming out of Russia, or do you think that they're presenting a different face, cooking the books, whatever? So there's 4 questions for 4 people. Please choose one and go ahead. So I'm going to turn first to Auricia.
I can try with the disinformation because I think Ukraine has been a lab for testing all various Russian disinformation tactics for a decade now. And it was something clear that they are preparing the ground for whichever harder security operations will follow. They start with the information operation. And they use these psycho-op operations now, even during the war. So, for example, either around nuclear safety of reactors or about invasion from Belarus, to keep society all the time in very high mode of anxiety for what may come. And I think it's important that countries and democracies, both on the front line and here, so to speak, deeper away from Russia, develop capacity to decipher, to monitor the content, and to push back where it's possible, to inform the public about what is going on, but also builds cognitive resilience of the on the demand side, people who are going online. For example, again, in Ukraine, there has been a school-wide program for high school students about media literacy, but embedding it within the language, within history, within other courses, so it's not something on the side, to understand the text, to distinguish fact from manipulation, and they have been quite effective. And I think we have to understand that our democracy is eroded when citizens do not share common facts. We will not be able to build any consensus. And I think this is where actually Ukraine could contribute quite a lot of its experiences and share it with other countries within EU and outside.
Russia, China one, I guess. Is that what you'd like? Oh, or make it a free choice.
Yeah, the Russia-China one,
yeah,
the bigger conflict.
Okay. On Russia, and China, I'm slightly concerned because my colleague Annette Bohr is in the audience, and she gave an entire presentation, a members' meeting on this the other day in much more detail than I would be able to. But I would say this: I suppose a lot has moved on since then, Annette, and there's been a flurry of Chinese diplomacy in the last week. And I said it was a week, yeah, and I would not have said perhaps a week ago that China wants to get involved, as it appears to be, in mediation efforts. So this is almost a new element into the equation, and a potentially concerning one, because China is talking about A, territorial integrity and its inviolability, and B, about security guarantees for Russia. And those two things are a contradiction in terms. At least according to Russia's definition of those anyway. They're a contradiction for Russia. And I think that is causing conniptions in Kiev, and I think partly in the West, which does not want to see a negotiation at the moment. It's too early for one, because Ukraine has not yet achieved enough on the battlefield to be able to have a successful negotiation or an outcome of a negotiation. So I think China's insertion or recent insertion to the debate is of concern, but we have to wait. The devil's in the detail, and we don't really yet know that, I suppose. Just very briefly, can I say something on the Russian figures, or do you want to completely do it? Yeah. Just very briefly. The answer is absolutely we don't know. Russians are withholding an awful lot of them right now, export figures, for example. And so the way you can do it, I mean, but we do know now that, so because you referred to the oil price cap, for example, we do know that that means that Russian oil a lot of Russian oil is being diverted elsewhere, but at a discount, which is being forced upon it, and it's also more expensive to take it elsewhere. And so, although the high price of oil last year was obviously having this unintended consequence, sanctions were having unintended consequences of forcing prices up, increasing revenues, then in fact the reality is now that January's figures are that actually Russian oil revenues are down 49%. That's how it makes most of its money. But if you really want to look at the figures, of course, Russia's trade figures, for example, you can go for the partner data, where it is exporting to, and then you can see the figures, but not from Russia itself.
Let's correlate.
Yeah.
Leslie?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your question about the U.S., absolutely. At this moment in time, it has been a tremendous commitment, effort, belief to support Ukraine, which doesn't mean that, there's a clear vision that's been articulated about what success looks like, what the outcome should or will be, or the bigger question at some point, what is the new regional security architecture going to look like? And the international security architecture isn't working, despite the fact the UNGA has passed resolutions, and that's not insignificant, but it's not going to do the job. The regional security architecture is clearly going to be insufficient if Russia changes. There are just a lot of known unknowns that are really very radical. But on the specific US question, we don't know who the Republican candidate is going to be. If it's Donald Trump, we know he isn't going to take a tough line on Russia. And that's going to change the public debate. Even if it ends up being not Donald Trump, which I very seriously believe it won't be in the end, if he gets the nomination, he's going to be in front of the cameras every single day telling Americans that we're spending too much. And if the media do what they did before, give him tons of free airtime, he's going to change the debate in the US and beyond the US. I personally suspect, but can't tell you how we get there, that Trump won't be the nominee. That's my view. But we don't know where the other candidates stand. And when we get into that moment in US history, they are going to be on television every single day. And the perspective that they take, whether it's DeSantis or Nikki Haley or Glenn Youngkin or somebody else, Pompeo, is going to change the public debate. It will not remain the same. So yes, so far, but it is going to be dynamic and it is going to change.
Just so on the data, I mean, James is absolutely right. It's much better not to publish the data because there are consequences of lying to the IMF, as indeed Argentina has found in the past. So actually, the easier thing is just not to publish the data. At the same time, I'm not so surprised that actually the short-term impact of the sanctions has not been as great as some initially thought. I mean, there were predictions of 15% reduction. That's partly because Russia has a very a competent macroeconomic team, and President Putin allows them to do their thing. So the things they did were actually what you would rationally do in response to the situation. It doesn't, however, change the sort of medium to long-term view of how bad the situation is likely to get to Russia because of the brain drain, lack of finance, loss of access to technology, and so on. Just on China, very briefly, I mean, it's really interesting, I think, 2 points. One is China clearly does not want its private sector companies to face the US Justice Department or secondary sanctions more generally. And so they have, although they've stepped up their imports of Russian energy, and there have been some additional deals signed with Russia on hydrocarbons, they've been very cautious about triggering the latter issue. I think also it's just worth bearing in mind that Europe, having experienced Russia's unreliability as an energy partner, you really wonder whether China would want to experience that unreliability as well, and whether in particular they would invest vast amounts of money in new infrastructure to import Russian energy, partly because of that unreliability and also because they'll be thinking about climate change in the longer term.
I've got some great questions online, and I can see there's many more in the room. So I just want to turn to online first and then go to in the room. Okay, so one of them is from Rogério de Oliveira de Souza. Sorry about my pronunciation. Hello from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. The feeling that we have from here is that Europe thought that Ukraine would fall fast. When Europe took notice that Ukrainian people would resist, the EU began to change its approach to the war, but it is still slow. Why not send heavy arms to expel Russian forces from Ukrainian territory? Okay, so then I have another one here. There's actually two from Tim Reed that I'm going to merge together. One is about the issue of the Wagner Group and the role that they're playing. And how does it actually work on the ground? What's the issue? What's the chain of command? How is it in the field? And then his second question is about the Ukrainian population in areas under Russian control. And how much of this is real, how much of it is involuntary, how much of it might actually be, are they truly serving? And then a final one from Dinah Mufti on whether or not, and I think this speaks to the previous question, but slightly different. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has catalyzed the growing alliance between Russia and China with a new world energy order, and the sort of petro-yuan weakening the US dollar, and what can be done from the US to mitigate that. So there's some questions there. I'm going to go back into the room and try to get some other questions. So could we have you over here, please? I'm not going to be able to get to you all, so just prepare yourself for disappointment. And if you could put your hand down in the middle, that would be great. Thank you very much.
I'm Sriram. I'm a member of Chatham House, and I have a question for Dr. Leslie. So how has the war in Ukraine impacted the US-UK relationship? And is it same as before it was the war? That's my question, yeah.
Thank you. And over there, please, the lady in the scarf.
Thank you. Mary Dozhevsky, journalist. I've got a question for Arisia. I want to borrow one of Patricia's questions. Ukraine has taken a very maximalist position on its demands. It wants borders reinstated as they were in '92, which includes recovery of Crimea. Is Ukraine prepared for failure?
Great. And then there was a gentleman at the back as well, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vincent Champion, private member and journalist. Earlier on, we were talking about regime change in Russia, and it was almost as if this could be a positive thing, but I don't see how it can happen. There are no intermediate sovereignties in Russia. There's no democratic traditions, as we understand it, of course. So who's actually going to fill the void if Putin goes? The opposition's either dead, fled, or in prison. Okay, the fled ones can come back, the imprisoned ones can be released, but where are the institutions for change in Russia? I don't see it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to have to stop there. I know there are many people who wanted to speak, and I'm really sorry. And you wouldn't believe how many questions we've got online. I'm really sorry. They're all fantastic questions, and I'm sure the ones in the room were as well. But we are actually now like 1 minute to go. So we have to have some quick fire rounds. So please don't answer every question. Please choose a question. I'm going to go in reverse order. So Korean, I'm going to go with you first.
Thanks very much. So firstly, just a point I should have made earlier about the consequences of Ukraine's resistance. This also changed the nature of the sanctions, because it meant they had a purpose, which was weakening Russia's ability to continue to fight the war. A lot of the initial debate was about, is this sufficient punishment? Is it deterrence? But actually it gave them a very real and important purpose, which is to weaken Russia's ability to continue. And that's not the case in all other sanction situations. Second point, just on the implications for the international currency system. I mean, this is really, really important and also really interesting. I think what the sanctions showed was that actually there were very few alternatives. There are no alternatives actually at the moment to convertible currencies issued by liberal democracies. And all those convertible currencies are ultimately linked via dollar swap lines and so forth. So, if you are, for example, China or another country thinking about what are the implications for us of what the West has done in relation to Russian foreign exchange reserves, it's very hard to think of anything you can do other than to try and divide. Now that could, people could say, well, what about cryptocurrency? But would you really want to hold $3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves in cryptocurrency? I think probably not. So I think this is a really important issue and one which certainly we in Chatham House want to do some further work on.
Yeah, on the US-UK question, great question, and thank you for asking. I think, the US-UK relationship is grounded in deep history with very strong fundamentals, thank God. Because if it weren't, it would be in real trouble right now. But obviously the UK role as a major security provider has been critical and important. And apart from the real question, which is about Ukraine, it's certainly been very important for the US-UK relationship in this window. However, it's undoubtedly the case that Americans are focused on Europe when it comes to responding to this conflict. They go to Brussels, they go to NATO, they go to the EU, and they don't talk about the UK, frankly, very much. I hear it mentioned almost not at all. And which isn't to say that it doesn't matter, but it's not where the game is. The game is on working with Europe, on sanctions, on security, on all sorts of things, and the UK needs to be in that conversation as much as it possibly can if it wants to be shaping it, informing it, seen as influential, seen as a player. So it's not great, but we all know that. On the question of whether it just makes more sense to be decisive because success breeds success, the question, should there just be more arms set? I mean, I think that is the number one question that people are wrestling with. And we know the fears about escalation, but I think it's going to be where the debate sits in the next several weeks. And the concern that I heard expressed at Munich, and I think that probably many people, including myself, agree with, is there still needs to be a sense of what is the end game, what are the conditions attached, what is the goal? Because just sort of blindly, and I'm not saying it is blindly, I think there are a whole lot of very serious strategic conversations that are taking place, but they're all taking place behind closed doors, so we don't actually know what they are. So we're sort of operating as, people who are informed, concerned professionals or public people on the basis of trust, which is very concerning when the stakes are so high. So that would be my sort of short answer to a very important question.
James.
Right, very quickly. How does Wagner Group actually work? Now, surprisingly, there are not large swathes of researchers wanting to go out into a field in DRC and Congo and Venezuela and Syria and eastern Ukraine, and to interview them. And when it did happen, because it's not a joke, then actually they were murdered. So that's the first point. But more interestingly, perhaps, is that there does seem to be some tension between Wagner Group and and the Russian military, between Gerasimov and Prigozhin, if you like. And it does seem as though Prigozhin's star does appear to be falling a little bit. And certainly Prigozhin has been, outspoken as he is in Russian elite terms, has been very critical of the conduct of the Russian war, and maybe and really on every other level except for Putin, and talked about there's been obstacles at the highest level, I think is what he was saying. So I think although quite clearly the two military operatives or operations are working to a certain extent in tandem, I think quite clearly this just isn't working out as well as had been hoped, and both sides are suffering, and Wagner has suffered some losses around Bakhmut lately. Very quickly then on regime change in Russia, I agree with your question, sir. I mean, it's the first point. I mean, institutions in Russia have been systematically dismantled over the past 10, 12 years, and in a way, Putin's problem has not been how to stay in office, but how to leave office, in fact, because he can't. I can see different scenarios. I can see a scenario whereby there is where there is a Putin-light kind of person who the West might just be able to see itself doing business with. But equally, I can see, the names of Kadyrov and Prigozhin, again, having just said his star has fallen, I know, but would presumably be much worse. There is still this sort of pro-war party and an anti-war party. Again, it's a bit generalistic, but there are hawks and doves everywhere, I suppose.
Rishi.
Right, so very interesting question from Brazil. Yes, obviously now we have the documented evidence of Ukrainian diplomats going into the offices in Berlin and saying, why are you asking us for weapons? The government is going to fall in a few days. So that was the operational presumption was that Kiev will fall, and somehow we'll deal with the outcome of it, perhaps at the lower cost as what it is at stake right now. Perhaps some even wished, no, not wished, but they were ready to accept such an outcome, because the only way you could defend the country if the country is fighting for itself. I mean, it was clear that Ukraine has been fighting for itself for the last 8 years before this full-fledged invasion, and it was put a lot of constraint on that capacity actually to repel Russian aggression. Let's not forget that. So it was in a bit of a boot camp for Ukrainians to train. But just to say that in the end, all these atrocities that Russia committed in Bucha, in Irpin, all the war crimes, the way Russia wages this war has shaken the European Union, has for the first time in history made European Union finance arms purchases for Ukraine. This has never happened, and grant Ukraine EU candidate status. This is significant. It is slow, but I think it's what is at stake at the moment. There was a very important question about populations on the occupied territories, Ukrainians there. There's, again, a lot of evidence being collected, and we have on our website videos from the cities that were liberated by Ukrainians, what people had to go through. At the beginning, when Russians saw that people will be meeting them with flowers, they were staying put. But when they saw resistance, there was all kinds of torture, illegal, deportations of children that is qualified as a genocidal war. And just to finish on Mary's question, I mean, I would again put it back to you. Would you be prepared for the failure of European way of life? Because if Ukraine fails, European way of life fails. This is not a conflict somewhere in a distant land. This is the conflict in the geographical heart of Europe that will have an implications for Ukraine, for Russia, and for Europe. And I would say at this point, Ukrainians are not prepared for failure. This is existential war for them, and they will fight even if there's no support from the West. How long is the question? Even if there's a nuclear attack on Ukrainian city, and there's no appetite for any concessions. So I agree we're in a long haul, but we could shorten the distance if the right strategic decisions are made in Washington, Brussels, Kiev, and other capitals in the global south come along, because I think we need to understand that this is not just about Western way of life. It's also about respect for borders, for countries, and it's putting an end to an imperial ambition in Europe that was drowning Europe in blood during the Second World War. And I think this is the fight worth fighting for.
That's a great way point at which to end. But I'm actually going to say, what did we miss? So We were talking about how it changed the world, but we haven't really talked about the impact on Africa. We haven't really talked about the impact on the Pacific, Southeast Asia, impact on India, Pakistan. We haven't talked about...
Another panel.
I know, another panel, and on China. And so we need another panel to look at this. But I think you'll understand why, you know, at Chatham House, where we are often struggling to get our work done because it's hard to get away from all these arguments and discussions that are going on. It's a great place to work. Can I just say that I think one of the things that may be happening that we're not paying enough attention to is what China may be doing with Russia. Yes, we are worrying about China supplying weapons, but China is also supplying Russia with money and getting something back for it, right? It will get land, it will get resources, it will get safe harbors, it will get positions in the Arctic. Let's be aware of what China will exact for its support of Russia, because I don't think people are paying enough attention to that. And I take your question and that in terms of the wider issue. I think it's a really important thing. So I want to thank our colleagues for putting this together. I want to thank all of you for coming. Thank everyone online for your great questions. This has been live streamed, so I guess it will appear on our website and on YouTube, so people can please share it around. Please watch it again for anything you might have missed or want to hear something in more detail. And please stay in touch with us and follow us on Twitter and retweet everything that we tweet. So thank you all very much.